The morning room at Harrogate Court smelled of beeswax and cold tea, and into that hush the dowager's voice fell like a dropped coin. Eleanor Vance stood at the long table with a stack of correspondence in her raw hands, and the three women near the window did not lower their voices, because they did not believe she had the faculty to be wounded by what they said. She was the steward's daughter, taken into the household to mend linen and carry trays, and the room had decided what she was within an hour of her arrival. "A girl who signs her wages with a cross," the dowager said, smoothing one glove. "She cannot even read the page she is handed." Eleanor did not lift her eyes from the letters. She had sorted them already by hand and by seal, by the senders she knew and the ones she did not, and she had read every line of every one of them in the gray hour before the house woke. What the room did not know was that she had been reading since she was 4 years old, taught at her father's knee by candle-end, and that she had spent the last 2 years reading the private papers of the most consequential man in 3 counties, without once being suspected of the skill. She kept her face plain. She kept her hands moving. Stay with me through this one, because the woman they thought could not read had already read the one document that would undo them all. Her father had been Thomas Vance, steward to the late Duke, and he had taught her letters the way other men taught their sons a trade, in secret and with care, because a girl who could read was a girl who could be blamed for knowing. When the old Duke died, and the debts came due, Thomas Vance died too, quietly, in the room behind the estate office, and Eleanor was kept on out of a charity that felt nothing like kindness. She was 19 now, slight, with brown hair pinned plainly under a linen cap and gray eyes that the household read as empty because she had trained them to give nothing back. Her gown was the color of weak tea, turned twice at the hem, and against the silks of Harrogate, it announced her station before she spoke. She had learned that the surest way to be left alone with a thing was to be thought incapable of understanding it. So she dusted the library and was handed ledgers to carry. She laid fires in the study and was trusted to tidy papers. No one imagined she could decipher. And every paper that passed through her hands, she read. She read them in the gray hour before the house woke, when the only light was the window and the only sound was the settling of old timber, and she returned each one to its exact place with the corner turned as she had found it. She read leases and rent rolls, and the long columns of the steward's accounts that no steward now kept, because the man who had kept them was dead, and no one had been honest enough to replace him. She read letters from creditors in London, and letters from the dowager to a solicitor named Hartwell, and she read the careful gaps in the accounts, where money had been, and was no longer. It was a strange education, this reading of a great house from its underside, this learning of who a family truly was, from the papers they believed no one could understand. The household thought her simple, and so the household was honest in front of her in the way people are honest, in front of a dog or a clock. She knew which footman was in debt, and which maid was with child, and which tenant had not been paid for the carting he had done in the spring. She knew the estate was sinking, and she knew whose hand had opened the seams. She knew, and she carried it, and she said nothing, because knowing was the only thing she owned, and to spend it was to have nothing left at all. The man at the center of the house was Gideon Marsh, the new Duke of Harrogate, and he had come into the title the way a man comes into a cold sea, all at once, and without choosing it. He was 32, tall and broad through the shoulder, with black hair cut close, and a jaw that the maids called carved and the dowager called proud. His eyes were the gray of slate under rain. He had been a younger son, a soldier, a man who expected to inherit nothing, and had built a careful distance from the family that had made that clear to him. Then his brother died without an heir, and the war ended, and Gideon found himself master of an estate drowning in obligations he had not made and could not yet measure. He did not trust the people around him, and he was right not to. He signed what his uncle's solicitor put before him because the alternative was to admit he could not yet tell a sound paper from a ruinous one. He was a man surrounded by documents and unable to be certain which of them were nooses. The dowager was Lady Augusta Marsh, the late Duke's mother, and she had ruled Harrogate through 2 reigns and intended to rule it through a 3rd. She was past 60, upright as a hearth iron, and her authority was the kind that had never once been tested to its breaking point. She had decided early that Gideon was a soldier who would tire of estate matters and leave them to her, and she had arranged the household to make that outcome inevitable. The solicitor was hers, the accounts were filtered through her, and the girl who carried the papers was, in her view, the safest possible witness to any of it, because the girl could not read. She liked to say so. She said it the way other women said the weather, as a settled fact, requiring no proof. Eleanor's first true proximity to the Duke came on a wet October evening when she carried Cole to the study and found him still at the desk, a single candle burning low, a lease before him that she had read 3 days earlier and known to be wrong. He did not look up at once. He sat with the unsigned page under his hand, and she saw the particular stillness of a man who suspects he is being cheated and cannot find the seam. "Bring the fire up," he said, his voice level. She knelt at the grate and built the coals, and behind her she heard the scratch of the pen. Pause, and start, and pause again. She knew the document. She knew that the rent it named was half what the land returned, and that the tenant signing it was the dowager's man, and that the difference would flow into an account that was not the estate's. She said nothing. It was not her place, and it was not safe, and she had learned both lessons in the same hard school. Even so, her hand, reaching for the last lump of coal, went still for a breath too long, and when she rose, she found his eyes on her, gray and direct, reading her the way she read the page. "Sit," he said. She did not understand the command, and so she remained standing, and he gestured once to the chair across the desk, an impropriety so complete that it startled her into obedience. He turned the lease toward her. "You carried this to me on Tuesday," he said. She agreed that she had. He watched her a moment longer, and then he did something no one in that house had done in 2 years. He asked her opinion. "What did you make of the men who brought it?" he said, and she understood that he was offering her a door dressed as a question, and that the safest thing was to step back from it. She told him the men had been nervous. She told him the older one had watched the younger sign. She gave him observation and withheld the reading, and he accepted it, and she carried the coal scuttle out with her heart going hard against her stays. She had given nothing away. She told herself that, and yet she had felt for the first time in 2 years the dangerous warmth of being looked at as though she were a person who knew things. In the passage outside the study, she stopped and pressed her back to the cool plaster and made herself breathe. The candle in the wall sconce guttered. She thought of the lease lying open on his desk, the figure written in a clerk's careful hand, £80, where the land returned 160, and the name of the tenant, a man called Brackley, who had never farmed an acre in his life, and who collected the difference at a coaching inn on the Bath Road on the second Tuesday of every quarter. She knew all of it. She had read the receipts. She had read the inn's name on a folded paper meant for the fire, and she had read the dowager's own hand acknowledging the sum, and she had carried that knowledge through the house every day since like a stone sewn into her hem. To speak it was to be undone. To stay silent was to watch the estate her father had served bled white by the woman who had let him die in the office behind the stairs. She had chosen silence 100 times. Tonight, for the first time, the choice had cost her something because tonight there had been a man in the room who looked as though he might have listened. The dowager voiced the label again 3 days later, and this time the whole drawing room heard it. There were guests, a neighboring baronet and his wife, and the conversation had turned to the difficulty of finding honest servants. Lady Augusta gestured toward Eleanor, who was refilling the tea, and said that the only servant in the house she fully trusted was the steward's girl, because the poor creature could neither read a letter nor count past her fingers, and so could carry any secret in perfect safety. The baronet's wife laughed. Eleanor poured the tea without a tremor. Across the room, the Duke set down his cup with a small, deliberate click, and looked at his grandmother with an expression. The dowager did not trouble to read because she had never once imagined that her authority might be examined from above rather than defended from below. Eleanor felt his glance move to her, and away she kept her eyes on the amber arc of the tea. She had been called many things in that house, but it was the smile on the baronet's wife's face that she carried up the back stairs that night and laid down beside all the others. The witnessing came in November, in the long gallery, and the Duke saw it, though she did not know he was there. A scullery boy named Peter, 9 years old and new to the house, had broken a porcelain shepherdess that the dowager prized, and he stood in the gallery white and shaking while the housekeeper described the beating that would follow. Eleanor came upon them with an armful of mended linen. She set the linen down. She knelt in front of the boy, and she did the thing that the household believed she could not do, though she did it quietly enough that only the boy and the man in the shadow of the doorway understood what it meant. She took the broken pieces, and she turned them in the light, and she said that the figure had been cracked already, an old fault in the glaze, and that it had been failing for months, and that no child's hand had truly broken it because it had been broken before any of them were born. Hull. She spoke with the authority of someone who had examined the thing closely and understood it. The housekeeper hesitated. The lie, if it was a lie, was told so precisely that it could not be argued with, and the boy was sent to the kitchen unharmed. In the doorway, the Duke stood very still and watched the steward's daughter defend the child with the one weapon she was not supposed to possess, the careful marshalling of fact, and he did not announce himself, and he did not forget. When the housekeeper had gone, Eleanor knelt a moment longer with the broken porcelain in her lap. The boy Peter had not run. He stood watching her with the wary stillness of a child who had learned that adults were weather to be survived rather than trusted. She told him to fetch the dustpan, and when he brought it, she showed him the old fracture in the glaze, the brown line running through the white like a river seen from a height, and she told him it was true what she had said, that the figure had been broken long before his hand ever touched it. "You did not break it," she said. "Remember that. People will tell you that you broke things you never touched. You must hold to what you saw with your own eyes." The boy nodded, not understanding, and she sent him to the kitchen with a heel of bread from her own pocket. She did not know that the Duke had heard every word. She did not know that he had come to the gallery to be alone with the portrait at its end, and had found instead a girl in a turned gown teaching a frightened child, the one lesson he had spent 2 years failing to teach himself. After that, the noticing began in earnest, though Eleanor read each instance through the long habit of her wound, and so misread them all. He found reasons to be in rooms she cleaned. He left papers on the desk and watched, with apparent idleness, whether her eyes moved across them. Once he asked her to fetch a particular volume from the library by its title, a test so transparent that she nearly smiled, and she brought him the wrong book with such convincing blankness that he frowned and could not be sure. She told herself his attention was suspicion, that he had begun to wonder about her, that the safest course was to give him less and less. Her body told her something else. When he entered a room, she knew it before she turned, knew it in the back of her neck, the sudden care of her own breathing. When his sleeve brushed her hand at the desk, she felt the contact for an hour. She catalogued these betrayals with despair because a girl in a tea-colored gown did not feel such things about a duke, and to feel them was simply one more way the house could destroy her. She did not yet permit herself the word want. The word was there all the same, under the floor of her thinking. Waiting. She would lie awake in the narrow room above the stables and list to herself. All the reasons it could not be, the difference in their stations, the certainty of his coming marriage, the plain fact that men of his rank did not see women of hers except as furniture that occasionally spoke. The list was sound. It changed nothing. Her body went on knowing where he was in any room, and her ear went on waiting for his step, and her treacherous heart went on lifting at the sound of it like a thing that had never been taught better. The dowager's plan, which Eleanor had read in full across a dozen documents she was never meant to comprehend, was nearly complete. Lady Augusta meant to marry the Duke to her great-niece, a polished young woman named Cassandra Pell, whose fortune would paper over the estate's debts, and whose pliability would keep the dowager's hand on the accounts for another generation. More than that, the dowager had been moving money for 2 years through a sequence of false leases and inflated repairs, building a private settlement against the day her control might be challenged, and she had buried the proof inside the very stack of papers that the steward's girl carried from room to room each morning. It was a perfect arrangement. The witness could not read, the solicitor was loyal, and the Duke, she believed, was too newly arrived and too proud to ask the questions that would expose her. Eleanor knew all of it. She had known for months. She had simply had nowhere to put the knowing, because to reveal it was to reveal the reading, and the reading was the one secret that had kept her safe. "Have you eaten today?" the Duke asked her one evening, finding her alone in the cold estate office, and the question was so far outside the grammar of their stations that she did not know how to answer it. He had come in without a candle and stood now in the doorway, a dark shape against the lamp-lit hall. "Eat something," he said, and it was not a kindness offered, but a command issued, and underneath the command she heard, though she did not let herself believe it, the shape of concern. She said she was not hungry. He crossed the room and set a plate beside her, bread and cold meat from the kitchen, carried in his own hands like a man who did not know he was doing anything strange. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He stood near the cold hearth and watched her not eat, and the silence in the room was the loudest thing she had heard in 2 years. He asked her abruptly whether she had been happy in this house. She told him the truth, which was that happiness had not been among the things she expected from it. Something moved in his face. He looked for a moment like a man about to set down a weight he had carried a long way. Then the housekeeper's step sounded in the hall, and the moment closed, and he left her with the untouched plate and a heart that had begun, against all sense, to hope. She ate the bread after he had gone alone in the cold office, and it was the first thing that day to taste of anything. She sat in the chair he had told her to sit in the room where her father had died, and she let herself remember the man who had taught her letters by the light of a candle end he was not supposed to take from the kitchen. "Patience," he had said, tracing the shapes of the words on the back of her small hand. "A letter is only a small picture of a sound. String them together, and you have a man's whole mind on a page, and no one can take it from you without your knowing." He had been proud of her in a way the world had no use for. He had died, believing she would have to hide that pride forever, and she had not been able to tell him otherwise, because there had been no otherwise to tell. Now there was a Duke who left bread on a desk, and asked whether she had been happy. She did not trust it. She had been taught too well what hope cost. Yet she carried the empty plate down to the scullery that night, holding it the way one holds a thing that has been given rather than a thing that has been used, and she washed it herself, and she set it on the shelf with a care the plate did not require. The midpoint brought the wound, and it came on the night she found him in the portrait gallery with the lamp turned low. There was a painting at the gallery's end that the household always passed and never discussed, a young woman in a blue gown with a child on her knee, and the Duke stood before it with his hand at his breast pocket, in a gesture Eleanor had seen 100 times and never understood. She had come to extinguish the lamps. She stopped. He did not send her away. He told her, in the flat voice menus for the wounds they have stopped expecting to heal, that the woman in the painting had been his brother's wife, and the child his brother's son, and that both had died of a fever in a single winter, while Gideon was at war, and that he had received the letter telling him so 3 months after they were buried. He had not been there, he had been unreachable, signing his name to orders that sent other men to die, while the only 2 people who had ever been glad of him slipped out of the world without him. From his breast pocket he drew a folded letter, soft with handling, the last his sister-in-law had ever written him, and Eleanor saw that he carried it always. This proof of his absence, this document he could read by heart, and could not bear to read it all. He did not weep. He simply stood with the letter in his hand, and Eleanor understood at last that his coldness was not pride, but penance. The discipline of a man who believed he had failed, the only people who had needed him, and who had decided never to be needed again because the cost of failing was past bearing. She wanted to tell him that she understood absence, that she too carried a folded grief. She said nothing. Still, when he returned the letter to his pocket, her hand had risen halfway toward his, and he had seen it, and neither of them spoke of it, and the silence had changed its nature entirely. They stood a long while in the low lamplight, the painted woman and child watching them from the gallery's end. He told her in the same flat voice that he had ordered the portrait left where it hung, because to take it down would be to agree that they were gone, and he was not yet able to agree to it. He said he had not spoken their names aloud to anyone in 3 years. He said the names. Then quietly, his brother Henry, and the boy Thomas, and the woman Maria. And the saying of them was so plainly an act of trust that Eleanor felt it as a physical thing, a door opening in a wall she had thought solid. She understood why the house called him cold. A man who has decided he will never again be the cause of someone's safety will build himself into stone, and the building will look like pride to everyone who has not seen the grief beneath it. She had seen it now. She would not be able to unsee it. When he finally turned from the portrait and looked at her, really looked, in the manner of a man surfacing from deep water, she did not lower her eyes as 2 years of training demanded. She let him see that she had heard him. It was the most reckless thing she had done in the whole of her time at Harrogate, and she could not bring herself to regret it. If you have ever kept a true thing hidden, because the truth was the only armor you had, you already know the weight she carried up the stairs that night. Leave a quiet word below. If her secret is one you understand. And then the house turned toward its reckoning, because the dowager had set her trap, and the day of its springing had come. The blow fell at the Harrogate ball, the great event of the season, the same gilded room where the dowager had ruled for 40 years. Eleanor had been kept below stairs, but she was sent up near midnight with a salver of glasses, and so she was present, in her tea-colored gown among the silks, when Lady Augusta chose her moment. The engagement of the Duke to her great niece was to be announced that night. The dowager had arranged it without his final consent, trusting that he would not make a scene before 300 guests. First, though, she meant to settle the small loose thread of the steward's girl who had grown too visible, whose name the Duke had spoken once too often. In front of the assembled company, Lady Augusta beckoned Eleanor forward and announced, with the warmth of a woman performing charity, that the poor creature was to be dismissed from the house, provided for modestly, sent away to a situation more suited to her limitations. Since a girl who could not read could hardly rise above the scullery, and it was cruel to let her imagine otherwise, the room's attention swung to Eleanor like a single turning head. Cassandra Pell, lovely and ice-blue, smiled. The smile of a woman watching an inconvenience removed. It was the 3rd time the label had been spoken aloud, and it was meant to be the final closing of a door, the verdict from which there was no appeal. Eleanor stood with the salver in her hands, and felt the old training reach for her, the instinct to give the room nothing, to carry the secret out the back stairs and survive. She looked for the Duke, and could not find him in the crush. She thought he had let it happen. She thought with a grief that astonished her by its depth, that he had chosen the polished cousin and the paper debts and the smooth running of the dowager's house, and that the moment in the gallery had been nothing more than one cold man's passing weakness. The path forward closed. She set the salver down on a side table with great care, because her hands had begun to shake, and she would not let the room see a single glass tremble. She had been seen, for 2 years, as a girl who could not read. She would walk out of the house being seen as nothing at all. That was the verdict, and she bent her head to receive it. The orchestra had not stopped. Somewhere beyond the press of silk and candlelight the musicians played on, unaware, and the small, bright sound of it made the silence around Eleanor worse. She felt the heat of 300 faces. She felt the cold of the salver's silver leaving her hands. She thought of the back stairs and the dark road, and the modest situation the dowager had so charitably arranged, some far house where a girl who carried secrets could be safely forgotten. And she understood that this had always been the shape of it, that a person of her station was permitted to be useful and then permitted to disappear, and that the kindness in the dowager's voice was the cruelest thing in the room because it asked her to be grateful for her own erasure. Lady Augusta watched her with the serene patience of a woman who had never in her life been refused. Eleanor had survived 2 years by giving that woman nothing, by being the empty vessel the house required, and the habit reached for her now and told her to be empty one last time and go. And then she lifted her head again, because she found that she could not because of pride, and not because of hope, but because of the boy. Peter stood at the edge of the servants' line near the door, the scullery boy whose beating she had prevented, and he was watching her be sent away with the same white terror he had worn the day of the shepherdess. And Eleanor discovered that there was one thing she would not do for safety. And that was, teach a child that integrity got you nothing, and silence got you out the door. She turned to the dowager. She did not raise her voice. In the hell breath of 300 people she said that she could read, that she had always been able to read, and that she had read every false lease, and every inflated account, and every private letter by which Lady Augusta Marsh had stolen from this estate for 2 years, and that the proof was where it had always been. I and the stack of papers the household trusted her to carry, because they were certain she was too stupid to understand them. The room did not breathe. The dowager's face did a thing that faces are not meant to do in public. And, from the far side of the room where he had been standing all along, the Duke began to walk. He crossed the floor in the silence the way a man crosses a battlefield after the guns have stopped, unhurried, certain, and the crowd parted before him. Without being asked, he did not go to the dowager. He went to Eleanor. He stopped before her, close enough that she had to lift her face to his, and the whole gilded room saw the master of Harrogate stand at the side of the steward's daughter in her tea-colored gown. He looked at her for a long moment, and there was, in his gray eyes, none of the coldness the house had built its peace upon. Then he turned to the assembled company, and he spoke. "Miss Vance reads better than any clerk I employ," he said. The words were level, and they carried to every corner of the room. Then he said the thing that ended it, the thing that could not be unsaid, the thing he had not rehearsed because he had only that moment known it for certain. "She stays," he said. "I am marrying her." The dowager made a sound that was not a word. Miss Pell's smile came apart at its careful seams, and then the second figure crossed the room, a thin gray man in black whom Eleanor recognized as Mr. Aldous, the Duke's own solicitor, newly retained that month and not the dowager's at all, who stepped to the Duke's side with a leather case under his arm, and confirmed in the dry voice of a man stating a settled matter that he had spent 3 weeks examining the estate's papers on his Grace's private instruction, that the irregularities Miss Vance described were precisely those he had found, and that the documents were even now secured beyond Lady Augusta's reach. The trap had been read and counter-read. The Duke had begun to suspect his grandmother weeks before on the night of the wrong lease, and he had quietly engaged his own man, and the only thing he had lacked was a witness who had seen the papers with understanding eyes. He had found her kneeling at a grate, building up his fire. The dowager sat down slowly in a gilt chair, and around her the room she had ruled for 40 years rearranged itself, not with cruelty, but with the simple, terrible swiftness of a verdict reversed. No one shouted. No one needed to. Lady Augusta had been the most certain person in every room she had ever entered, and she had been certain of the wrong thing. And the wrongness of it was now visible to everyone she had ever commanded. Eleanor did not gloat, because she had never learned how, and because the boy by the door was watching, and because the man before her had just laid down 2 years of careful coldness in front of 300 people who would tell the story for the rest of their lives. Around the room the recognition moved like a change in the air before rain. An old woman near the orchestra, who had known the late steward, pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. A young lord who had laughed at the dowager's joke about the scullery now found the floor very interesting. The baronet's wife, who had laughed in the drawing-room a month before, did not laugh now. The crowd that had been the instrument of every verdict against Eleanor became, in the space of a single sentence, the witness to her vindication, and not one of them could ever again pretend they had not seen it. She only looked up at him, and let him see at last the thing her body had been telling her for months, and her mind had refused. He took her hand, he did not let it go. They were married in the small church on the estate 3 weeks later, with the tenants in the pews, and the dowager removed to the dower house, corrected and quiet, her hand lifted from the accounts, but her place at the family table preserved, because Gideon did not believe in punishing beyond the point that justice required. And Eleanor had asked him for mercy in the same plain voice she used. For everything true, Mr. Aldous put the estate's papers in order. The false leases were unwound, the stolen money recovered, the tenants set right. Cassandra went back to London, and was in time very advantageously married to someone else, and bore the whole affair with more grace than anyone had expected, because she had never wanted the cold Duke, either. Only the position, and there were other positions. The first snow came at the end of December, and Eleanor stood at the long window of the study that had once been only a room she laid fires in, and watched it fall across the grounds that were now, impossibly, her home. End quote. There was a fire in the grate that she had not built, and would never again be asked to. Peter kept on, and elevated to the Duke's own service, had brought up the evening coal and lingered to watch the snow, and she had let him, because the household she meant to keep was not the one she had survived. On the desk beside her lay the folded letter from the gallery, the one Gideon carried, set down now where it could rest, because he had told her at last the whole of it, and in the telling had begun to set the weight down. And beside it, where she had placed it that morning, lay a second folded paper, soft at its creases, a thing she had carried for 11 years, and never shown a living soul. It was the last letter her father had written her, in his careful steward's hand, and it said only that a person who could read could never be wholly poor, because the truth was a country no one could turn her out of. Gideon came in behind her and stood at her shoulder, and together they watched the snow erase the line between the lawns and the lane. He asked her, quietly, what she was reading. She lifted her father's letter so the firelight caught the faded ink, and she read it aloud to him, every word, in the voice they had all sworn she did not have. Outside, the snow went on falling, patient and white, over the house that had decided what she was, and had been, in the end, entirely mistaken. She had been a girl who could not read. She had read every document he signed. And now, she signed her own name, Eleanor Marsh, in a hand as fine as her father's, on the only page that had ever truly been hers. Thank you for staying to the end of this one. If Eleanor's quiet courage stayed with you, leave a word below, and tell me the moment you felt the room turn.